You can write down a queue definition in ParallelCluster, defining an entire new type of node to solve an entire new type of problem that you had that you did not have 2 years ago when you were designing your cluster the first time.
All right, so traditional on-premises, you've got a fixed set of nodes that could change, but usually it's a pretty involved process. When you're using ParallelCluster and you're doing capacity planning, what does that look like when using a tool in the cloud?
Okay, so you can do it one of two ways. In your ParallelCluster design, you can explicitly add nodes, take nodes away. But my favorite thing about ParallelCluster is that you can, that it itself, the software itself, can also drive an elastic cluster. And what that means is it can dynamically and automatically increase and decrease the number of compute instances that are running. And that just depends on how much work is pending in the job queues. It means if there's a lull in usage, your cluster can scale, if you've configured it, all the way down to 0 compute instances. It's just running the head nodes and the login nodes. If there's a peak, it can scale up to the maximum size that you've defined. And that scale up and that scale down is usually pretty quick. It's on the order of a few minutes either way. When you design your system, your ParallelCluster system, you define queues. And then within those queues, you define groups of instances that service the jobs that are submitted to that queue. But these aren't, node 1, node 2, node 3, node 4. Instead, you just kind of give ParallelCluster a recipe for the kinds of nodes that it needs to launch to service that queue. And you can mix and match. You can do all sorts of things with it. They can be general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, GPU instances. That's totally up to your needs.
You can write down a queue definition in ParallelCluster, defining an entire new type of node to solve an entire new type of problem that you had that you did not have 2 years ago when you were designing your cluster the first time. Suddenly, I need a bunch of nodes with a really, really large amount of memory to core, huge amounts of RAM per core, because I have a workload for the next 3 months, which can absolutely run really quickly, only in that kind of environment, and create a queue.
Or like there's a new instance type. It's a new CPU architecture, or new GPU architecture, or a new vendor, or some new magical new AWS silicon. Adding that to your cluster is editing a file, telling ParallelCluster about it.
And this is really cool. Just recently, we released the HPC 7A instance, right, which is an upgrade on its predecessor, the HPC 6A. You could create a queue in about 3 or 4 minutes. You could create a new queue that's just a copy of the old one using the HPC 6A. You just copy the new one to a 7A. You can run the same job in both queues and see which one runs faster, and then make your decision as to which one you want to commit to longer term. You could discover that this new chip is amazing, and it gets your jobs run 40% faster for like the same price, or only 10% more. You could look at that and see the ROI and go, that's crazy good. I'm gonna go with the new CPU. Or you could discover that newer actually isn't always better. And in this instance, for your code, I'm going to stick with the old one. You can make that decision in 20, 30 minutes.
What if I wanted my queue size to scale like dynamically, right? How do I set up that scaling behavior within ParallelCluster?
Okay. So basically, when you define your queue, you set scaling behavior. You set the minimum and the maximum number of instances that ParallelCluster is going to launch. If that minimum is 0, then when that group of nodes doesn't have any work, ParallelCluster and EC2 will work together to tear those instances down, and then you won't be billed for them. If it's larger than 0, so if you set your minimum to, let's say, 4, you always want to have 4 nodes hot, ready to take a job, then it'll scale down to 4. Then when you set your maximum, let's say you want to have a node between 4, or a queue and a node group that has between 4 and 64 instances. So when a bunch of work comes in, ParallelCluster works with EC2 to bring new instances up, configured configured to join the cluster, accept the jobs from the queue, do the work, and then when it's done, they start to scale down back to the minimum that you've set. Just like everything in ParallelCluster, you can change these values later or kind of on demand when you see how your cluster fares supporting your customers, your end users' use cases.
If you're enjoying these videos, please give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel so that we can keep making more to help you understand how the cloud works and to show you new ways to help all the scientists and engineers around you who use HPC every day to do amazing things. It's what gets us motivated as well.